The Polikarpov I-15 belonged to the last moment when a good biplane could still be dangerous instead of merely old. In Spain and in clashes on the Soviet Far East frontier, it earned respect in low-altitude turning fights. But once speed, diving performance, and firepower started deciding who lived and who died, the I-15 began to look less like a hero and more like the best possible version of a dying idea. The Polikarpov I-16 still feels shocking in hindsight because it arrived early with features that looked like the next era: low wing, retractable landing gear, compact shape, aggressive intent. In the Spanish Civil War, it looked revolutionary. By 1941, it was being punished by newer German fighters. That contrast is exactly why the I-16 stays alive in memory. It helped announce the future, then got overtaken by the same future it had helped create. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-1 has almost no romantic aura, and that is part of its meaning. It was a rushed answer to Soviet worries about high-altitude threats, but it reached units before the concept had matured into something pilots truly trusted. The MiG-1 is remembered less as a failed legend than as war forcing a design bureau to admit, very quickly, that first drafts do not survive contact with reality. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-3 is one of the clearest examples of a respectable fighter meeting the wrong war. It had genuine value at high altitude and found a useful place in the defense of Moscow, but the Eastern Front kept dragging combat into the low and medium altitudes where everyday survival mattered more than elegant interceptor logic. That is why people often talk about the MiG-3 with sympathy rather than admiration. It was serious, capable, and still somehow misplaced. The Yakovlev Yak-1 mattered because it fit the war Soviet pilots were actually flying: escort work, rough airfields, low and medium-altitude combat, constant improvisation. This was where the Yak-1 earned trust. It was not famous for one magical trait. It was famous because it got the basics right and became the foundation for a fighter family that matched Eastern Front reality better than many more specialized designs. The Yakovlev Yak-7 sounds like the kind of backstory aviation fans love, a trainer-derived aircraft that became a credible fighter. In combat, that practicality was exactly its strength. It never turned into the glamorous face of Soviet fighter aviation, but it helped stabilize the Yak line and is still respected as the kind of honest wartime machine that wins campaigns while flashier aircraft get the mythology. The Yakovlev Yak-9 is where the Yak formula stopped being promising and started feeling inevitable. It was adaptable, produced in huge numbers, and effective in the low to medium-altitude fighting that dominated so much of the Soviet-German air war. People remember it not as an exotic masterpiece, but as the fighter that kept showing up in the exact form the war required. The Yakovlev Yak-3 arrived late enough to feel concentrated, less a beginning than a sharpened ending. By 1944, it had become one of the most admired Soviet piston fighters, and its reputation was reinforced by both Soviet pilots and the Normandy Niemann Group. Enthusiasts still talk about the Yak-3 with unusual affection because it feels like the moment the Yak family became not just practical, but beautiful in combat terms. The Lavochkin-Gorbunov-Gudkov LaGG-3 may be the easiest Soviet fighter to write dramatically because it came with its own legend of disappointment. In combat, it was criticized as heavy and underpowered, and Soviet pilots gave it one of the most famous nicknames in aviation history: the Varnished Coffin. That phrase still survives in blogs and aviation communities because it captures the whole tragedy in one line: a modern-looking fighter that reached war before it was truly good enough for war. The Lavochkin La-5 is where that grim story flips. By reworking the troubled lag line around a radial engine and turning theory into something pilots could actually survive in, Soviet industry produced a real answer instead of another apology. Around Stalingrad and then Kursk, the La-5 helped restore confidence in Lavochkin fighters, which is why so many later discussions treat it almost as redemption in airframe form. The Lavochkin La-7 is remembered with the respect reserved for machines that finish a hard journey properly. It refined the La-5 into something faster, cleaner, and more lethal, and its association with aces like Ivan Kozadub gave it lasting prestige. What makes the La-7 especially satisfying in public memory is the arc behind it. People love a recovery story, and this one runs from the mocked Lag-3 to one of the Soviet Union's finest late-war piston fighters. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-9 was the Soviet Union entering the jet age without any illusion that the hard part was over. It was the first Soviet turbojet fighter, but it also carried very real technical problems, including engine flameouts tied to gun gas ingestion. The MiG-9 never became glamorous. It survives in memory as a threshold aircraft, important because it dragged Soviet fighter aviation out of piston certainty and into jet uncertainty. The Yakovlev Yak-15, along with the later Yakovlev Yak-17 and Yakovlev Yak-23 that followed the same transitional logic, was essentially a bridge with guns. It still looked half-rooted in the piston era because that was the whole point: move pilots, mechanics, and doctrine into jet operations quickly. Nobody confuses it with a final answer, but that visible awkwardness is exactly why enthusiasts still find it fascinating. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-15 is where Soviet jet fighters stopped being interesting and started being alarming. In Korea, it turned MiG Alley into one of the defining air combat zones of the early Cold War and shattered any comfortable assumption that post-war jet superiority would belong to one side by default. People still speak about the MiG-15 with respect because it was not merely good. It arrived at the exact moment when a good aircraft could change the strategic mood of a war. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-17 never had the same dramatic debut as the MiG-15, but its later combat life may be even more revealing. In Vietnamese service, it proved that a relatively simple, agile fighter could still punish faster and more modern opponents when tactics and positioning favored it. That is why the MiG-17 keeps showing up in debates about air combat fundamentals. It reminds people that speed widens the margin, but it does not erase geometry. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-19 does not dominate public imagination the way the MiG-21 does, but historians keep returning to it for one reason: it made supersonic performance operational reality. Much of its combat reputation came through export users rather than a giant Soviet war narrative, which is why it feels more like a hinge than a superstar. The MiG-19 matters more than it is loved, and that is a perfectly fair way to remember it. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-21 became so widespread it almost escaped its own nationality. It fought over Vietnam, the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa, and proved that a compact, fast, relatively austere interceptor could become the global face of Soviet fighter power. What gives the MiG-21 extra life today is that people still argue about it with real feeling. In simulation communities, it is constantly described as charming, demanding, and workload-heavy, the kind of airplane that punishes laziness and rewards discipline. The Sukhoi Su-9 was never meant to be romantic. It was built for a Soviet Union that feared intrusions over immense airspace more than it dreamed of classic dogfights. So what mattered was speed, missiles, all-weather interception, and obedience to ground control. The Su-9 has a cold reputation because it feels less like a pilot's fighter and more like the first clean expression of the Soviet air defense machine that would later produce even harsher interceptors. The Yakovlev Yak-25 lived in the same anxious world, but in a more patient way. It was built to guard northern and eastern approaches, fly in poor weather, and keep watch when ordinary tactical fighters were the wrong tool. Crews generally liked it, which helps explain why enthusiasts often remember it more warmly than its fame would suggest. The later Yakovlev Yak-28P pushed the same logic further, but the Yak-25 marks the moment Soviet fighter development clearly split into battlefield machines and homeland sentries. The Sukhoi Su-15 became one of the hardest-edged symbols of the Soviet air defense state. It was built to replace the Su-9 and Sukhoi Su-11 against tougher Western bomber threats, and it spent its life in a world of alerts, interceptions, and political tension rather than glamorous fighter lore. Its name is inseparable from the destruction of Korean Airlines Flight 007 on September 1, 1983, which is why the Su-15 is remembered not as a crowd-pleasing fighter, but as a grim instrument of Cold War suspicion. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-23 tried to move beyond the MiG-21 without losing the Soviet appetite for speed and reach. Its variable sweep wing made it look sophisticated and menacing, but its reputation in Middle Eastern and African wars became famously mixed: dangerous when flown well, disappointing when training, doctrine, or maintenance were weak. That split still defines how people talk about it today. Neither fraud nor masterpiece, but a fighter that demanded more than many air forces were ready to give. The Mikoyan-Gurevich MiG-25 was built out of Cold War panic, and it looked like panic made visible. It stunned the West with its speed and altitude, then became even more legendary when Viktor Belenko defected with one to Japan in 1976, turning the Foxbat into both an intelligence prize and a pop culture object. What still fascinates people is the reveal. The MiG-25 was not an all-purpose superfighter, but a brutally specialized machine, and that specialization is exactly what made it unforgettable. The Mikoyan MiG-31 took the MiG-25 idea and made it smarter instead of merely faster. It was built to cover enormous distances, detect threats far away, and intercept bombers or cruise missiles before they got close enough to matter, which is why analysts still describe it as a strategic interceptor rather than a cinematic dogfighter. In enthusiast circles, the MiG-31 has a strange prestige because it feels like one of the last aircraft designed for a uniquely Soviet problem, not winning a flashy duel, but guarding the size of a continent. The Mikoyan MiG-29 entered service looking exactly like what people imagined a late Cold War Soviet fighter should look like: lean, aggressive, agile, and dangerous in close combat. Its legend grew further after German MiG-29s were used in training against NATO aircraft, where Western pilots came away deeply respectful of the helmet-mounted sight and our 73 missile combination. That matters because the MiG-29's reputation was never built on one decisive Soviet war. It was built on the unnerving possibility that in a close fight, this thing could still be nasty. The Sukhoi Su-27 changed Western perceptions before it even needed a defining Soviet combat record. It was built as a direct competitor to fighters like the F-14 and F-15, and when the flanker appeared publicly, especially in its dramatic displays, it looked like the Soviet Union had stopped merely fielding dangerous fighters and started aiming for the very top tier. That is why the Su-27 still carries an aura in enthusiast culture. It felt like the moment Soviet fighter design became openly ambitious and visibly elegant at the same time. The Sukhoi Su-30 is where the flanker family stopped being just an air superiority fighter and became a system with real strategic breadth. In Russian service and with major export users, it proved valuable because it could patrol, escort, strike, and manage complex missions in ways older Soviet fighters could not. The Su-30 matters because it showed Sukhoi could take one strong design and stretch it into something countries could keep building doctrine around. The Sukhoi Su-33 is one of those aircraft whose symbolism may be bigger than its combat record. It gave the carrier Admiral Kuznetsov a real fleet fighter, and its Syria deployment showed that Russia still wanted to be seen as a carrier aviation power. But that same deployment also exposed how fragile the system was when one Su-33 was lost after an arresting gear failure during recovery. That is why people talk about the Su-33 with admiration and skepticism in equal measure. The Sukhoi Su-35 is the most polished non-stealth form of the flanker idea, and for that reason it attracts both praise and argument. Its deployment to Syria in 2016 reinforced the image of a high-end Russian fighter able to provide escort and deterrence, while its later appearance in the war against Ukraine pushed it into a much harsher environment where survivability, doctrine, and attrition mattered as much as raw aerodynamic quality. Modern discussion around the Su-35 is therefore less about fantasy and more about a hard question. How much can even an elite fourth-generation derivative do against dense air defenses? The Mikoyan MiG-35 carries a very different mood. On paper, it was supposed to keep the MiG name alive with a modernized light multi-role fighter, but in practice procurement stayed small, and the aircraft was often discussed more as a promise than as a force that would reshape Russian fighter aviation. That gives the MiG-35 a melancholy fascination, proof that the MiG design tradition still had technical life, but not enough political weight to recover its old place. The Sukhoi Su-57 is Russia's argument that it still belongs in the fifth-generation conversation, but it remains more debated than settled. It first flew in 2010, entered Russian service in 2020, and has been used cautiously in the context of Syria and the war against Ukraine, yet much of the discussion still revolves around limited numbers, careful employment, and whether production can ever fully match ambition. That is why the Su-57 does not yet feel like a finished legend. It feels like a test case.